So they began, and by 1710, somebody said, well, how are we going to control all these blacks? So the state of Virginia passed a law called meritorious manumission. Meritorious manumission then says that we will control blacks by building in an internal attitude inside of them to make them see things through our eyes, to make them white in everything but skin color. And what the meritorious manumission was passed by the state of Virginia in 1710 then said we will reward any black who gets very good at this. And so if any black person saves a white person's life, protects a white person's property, invents something that a white person can make money off of, or if he squeals on in the slave revolts, he would get freedom. Okay? And so I tracked from 1710, from 1710 all the way up to 1860s. And out of over 200 some possible slave revolts, a black person squealed in every one of them. And so following that up, so in 1712, there's a guy down named Willie Lynch, 2 years later down in Jamaica. He heard about the law, and he came up to Virginia and says, I know how to do it. I can help you set up a system where black folk will never, ever organize and come together again. He says, I got a lot of experience in the islands on treating blacks. And so that's when y'all heard about the Willie Lynch letter. That's what that case. So Willie Lynch came up 2 years later, and they paid Willie Lynch to be a consultant to carry out what was enacted in Virginia in 1710. He says, I would divide blacks along lines of sex, along lines of skin color, along lines of age, tribe, everything. He said, in that way they'd never get organized again. They would never, ever have a community. I would divide them so they'd never have a community that would be functional. And Willie Lynch started that, and as Willie Lynch started that, blacks began to squeal on each other. 100 years later, by 1840, for instance, I had over 6,000 blacks in the United States that were slave owners. 6,000 blacks owned other slaves by 1840. Because as soon as they got free under meritorious manumission, they ran out and tried to be white and hired and bought them some black slaves. And then when you saw tears coming out of my eyes, I just thought about, again, I was thinking about down in New Orleans. Down in New Orleans, and blacks down there saying, Dr. Anderson, what can bring us together? And I said, you got a big problem. They said, why? And that's why I had the tears. Let me tell you something. In New Orleans was the epitome of black folk doing in other black folk. On the eve of the Civil War in New Orleans, you had almost approximately 812 free blacks in New Orleans on the eve of the Civil War. 642 owned other black slaves. Then in the Civil War, New Orleans put together 2 full regiments of blacks to fight with the South to keep slavery. And worse than that, one of the biggest revolts, slave revolts, occurred in New Orleans, where blacks tried to break free. And do you know that the free blacks joined the white plantation owners and went and put down the black slave revolt? And the worst part about it, they chopped off all the heads of all the blacks that were revolting and put them on poles leading all the way from Jefferson Parish all the way into the city of New Orleans as a warning against any other blacks trying to get free of the system. And see, that hurts me when I hear about that. And so, you see, you got that meritorious manumission policy saying, keep black folk divided. So between 1712 now and up until the Civil War, some things started happening that's very profound for you all in understanding your racial situation out here. By 1750, black folk peaked out. The population of blacks in America got up to 34%. And then the white society got very scared with that. They said, with that kind of number in this country, there's a possibility that blacks might get together with Indians. So then in every treaty that whites were signing with Indian treaties, they put an incentive in there for the Indians to turn against black folk. They say every time you catch a black, you're to turn him in. And they would pay an Indian $20 on average to chase down an escaped runaway slave, to track him in the woods and bring him back to his plantation. And because of that, Indians in America allied with the white dominant society. And I keep hearing blacks bragging about the fact how much Indian blood they got. Indians were not your friends in history. They were not your friends. And I don't mean to put the Indians down. Indians got special problems. I'm not putting anybody else down. I'm not going to put the Hispanics down. I'm going to tell you the truth. And out of the 5 civilized tribes, out of the 5 civilized tribes in the United States, all five of them sided with the South to keep slavery. In a 20-year period between 1840 and 1860, the biggest killers of blacks in America were Indians. And see, the Indians then, so that's what they were trying to get, that kind of an ally between whites and Indians, so that blacks could not ally with them. And that's why every civilized tribe was a slave trader. Indian tribe was a slave trader and a slave owner. As a matter of fact, in Camp Smith, right not too far from me in Texas, in 1867, in Camp Smith, the Choctaws and the Chickasaws still had slaves even 2 years after the war and wouldn't turn them loose. And the United States government gave them $300,000 to turn black slaves loose to the Chickasaw and Choctaw Indians and said, we'll give you $300,000 and take this money and divide it up and turn those black slaves loose and give them some land. And they never, but 2 years later in 1869, blacks were coming to Washington saying the Indians never gave them anything. And to this day, blacks never got a penny from the Indians. So what I'm saying is everybody has been against blacks because we've never been united. But so when I leave here after today, I want you all to be together, okay? And so by 1750, we hit 34 population. That scared, the colonies were scared. So they started petitioning England to quit shipping any more slaves in. And that's what triggered the Revolutionary War. And one of the biggest things was that they were scared that blacks and Indians might somehow get together and take over the country. And so after the war was over, well, let me get before that. Then the Constitution was written. When the Constitution was written, what they did, they went back and picked up the slave codes I told you about, the slave codes and the enslavement laws. That's why in the United States Constitution they classify you as 3/5 of a human being, why they passed the Fugitive Slave Act, and why they condone, okay, slavery. That's why you got locked into that whole system. Because what they did then was give all the power to the slaveholding states in the South. And the first compromise was committed at that time. And what happened then, the wealthy whites in the country says, we will allow people to keep slaves, but we'll always protect poor whites. And so they started a system saying, wealthy whites up here, poor whites here, blacks down there. So even if you're a wealthy white, you'll make sure that poor whites are at least the management class, that they're over the blacks, they're the supervisors. So the blacks go into the ditch, the white would stand over it, the poor white would be over the ditch. If you put a black person on the truck, the white would drive the truck. Okay? That was a commitment that was made that poor whites would always come at least right above blacks. And I'm going to show you how that got into all our national public policies later on. And so between that, so that was built into the Constitution. Now they developed a system in this country. I hope my time is on. Is my time running through? Okay. So they built into the Constitution, right after the Constitution was initiated, they built the Constitution based on the premise that you're going to have a social democracy. Very important for black folk. A social democracy means that the majority will win, the minority will lose and suffer. But also in the Federalist Papers, it says that the majority then can never do anything to stop the minority from becoming a majority. And it is the majority's responsibility to protect the minority. And as soon as the Constitution was built on that, it was violated next year, 1 year later. Whites in America never accepted that it was their responsibility to protect black folk if you're going to make them a minority. They talking about black folks shouldn't be out now chasing civil rights as a minority. They know that as a minority you can't win. You don't have the power. It is the majority's responsibility to take care of the minority. Not the minority's responsibility to fight for something you can't get. You don't have the power.